Despite Earth being over 1 billion years old, and the homogeneous genus that we Homo sapiens belong to has existed for nearly 2.8 million years, much of our history and what we understand only covers a few thousand years. And in these last few thousand years, our understanding and telling of this history has also changed quite significantly. Today, I wanted to look at some interesting examples of how stories and historic records have changed and how these stories have been told. Some of the things that I'll cover in this video are funny, interesting, kind of weird, and of course, just absolutely horrible. But without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the ancient world. Now, of course, there is so many different places that I could cover within the ancient world, but let's specifically talk about the Mediterranean region, and specifically during the period of 425 BC. The person I want to look at today is a man named Herodotus.
Look at this dude.
The Romans would eventually deem this guy to be the father of history, if that indicates anything about what I'm about to talk about. One of Herodotus's most famous works was called the Histories, and the Histories would retell the accounts of the Greco-Persian Wars. Interestingly enough, when this Histories work was originally released, some people criticized it for not really being very accurate and having some mythological accounts to it, not really making it a realistic or good account of history. And yes, there may be some specific examples within here, inaccurate storytelling, such as when he describes a phoenix within Egypt. However, there are some other claims that could be more simply explained, such as a simple mistranslation when he was recounting his adventures in India and he saw furry ants that were the size of dogs within India, which most likely these were just marmots. And despite a few specific examples such as the phoenix, which aren't so easily explained, archaeological evidence has actually backed up a lot of the accounts within the Histories, proving that yes, the Histories was a somewhat accurate retelling of the Greco-Persian Wars and also just accounts in the region. Interestingly enough, within the Histories, Herodotus would also talk about the Battle of Thermopylae. And if that sounds familiar, that is because Zack Snyder wrote a comic book and later a film adaptation of this battle, which was called 300. Zack Snyder's interpretation of the Battle of Thermopylae is its own interesting little case study into how history is retold and understood. Within both the comic book and the movie does show what he is thinking at the time and reflect his personal traits as a human, which is part of art, which just goes to show how history can be retold in different forms to reflect different beliefs. With that idea in mind, let's go ahead and do a nice little jump 1400 years into the future to 1000 AD. And if you were living in England at this time, and if you wanted a detailed account of Anglo-Norman society, you might have read the works of Ordix Vitalis. Ordix Vitalis was a monk who, during this time, wrote many detailed accounts of what life was like. It's important to note that during 1000 AD and in medieval Europe as a whole, everyone was extremely religious, and religion was extremely important. So it's no surprise that his writings would include elements of religious framework. His works are really interesting because it's very detailed accounts of history with descriptions of religion. And I'm gonna be honest, I read essays about it. I did not read it myself or anything too deeply, but it is interesting how during this time, such religious atmospheres, and of course being a monk, is going to influence you into writing history through a religious lens. Now, just 300 years later, we have essentially the direct opposite of a heavily religious historical account with Voltaire. Voltaire was a French writer and historian, and also was part of the Enlightenment movement, and he was also a philosopher. I mention him in this video because he is essentially a direct opposite of what I just described. With a heavily religious account of history, Voltaire was very upset with 1700 France in the Catholic Church at the time. So, in his accounts of history, he avoided using religious frameworks in his retelling of history, and he would focus on social and cultural elements within his accounts of history. He's most famous for his work about Louis XVI, as well as an essay on the customs and the spirits of nations, which was released in 1756. Within this essay, he completely rejects any theological frameworks of history, and he would emphasize things like economics, culture, and political history, which definitely reflects how he felt with the current state of France at the time, and also what he was doing. He was an activist, he was a writer, so of course he is going to have strong opinions about society, and he would treat Europe as a single entity rather than a collection of nations. Keep in mind, this is what Europe looked at the time. Also, he'd be the first person to emphasize how influenced medieval culture was by Middle Eastern civilizations. And he would also expose the intolerance and fraud of the Catholic Church throughout history, which is also quite interesting. Although Voltaire would reject theological frameworks for his telling of history, his inclusion and focus on things such as social and political or economic things within societies goes to show what he valued within his own society and what he held deeply to himself. And it is interesting that he would completely reject what would be previously 300 years ago so incredibly important within one person's telling of history. And although I've talked about more general and artistic forms of understanding history and the analysis of history, and even the fabrication of history has been used for nation building and the reinforcement of ideologies. One such example, of course, would be the Nazis and how they would use history and their grotesque retelling of it to justify their atrocities. Hitler was obsessed with the idea of an Aryan mythology. He would fund expensive expeditions in hopes of finding anything to back up this made-up idea that he had in order to justify his atrocities and show people that he actually had evidence to what he is talking about. These pseudoscientific beliefs and made-up mythology, of course, would be a core backbone of what the Nazis would use in order to justify their atrocities during World War II. In modern day, this mythology is largely laughed at, though there is a few people without chins who do somehow still believe this. And speaking of modern day, let's talk about how history is accessible and understood today. Nowadays, you can consume all sorts of history media, and it is accessible pretty much anywhere. Whether it's in a more formal setting like a classroom, or on TikTok, or even the video you are watching right now, information is widespread and more accessible than it has ever been. However, just as it was important to understand the framework and intentions of someone recounting history back in the 1000 AD, it's just as important as it is today. The next time you see a history video or someone sharing really any piece of media, always think about what their intention is behind making that piece of media. What is their message? Are they really trying to get off a factual piece of information? Or are they trying to push an ideology and get you to think a certain way without telling the full truth? Understanding information that is being presented to you is just as important as understanding why it is being presented to you. With that being said, I think this is a great place to end off this video, and I hope you all enjoyed watching. My YouTube members, thank you so much for supporting me financially. It truly does mean the most. And remember to always be observant with any piece of media, especially what we see nowadays. We are always consuming so much information every single day, so it's important to always use critical thinking and, check your sources. Think of why someone is sharing a piece of information, and always, just think for yourself. So with all that being said, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.